What happens to a civilization when the very edges of its world begin to tremble? When the horizon that once marked safety becomes the line where nightmares gather? What would you do if the border you trusted suddenly became the doorway through which an unstoppable force walked? These are not distant hypotheticals. This was the reality for Europe when the Hunnic leaders arrived at its frontiers, reshaping everything the continent believed about warfare, fear, and human limits. Their presence alone disrupted systems that had stood for centuries, and their methods struck so deeply into the European psyche that even their enemies hesitated to record the truth. To understand how shocking these events were, you need to imagine the frontier as the Romans saw it, a living shield fortified by stone, soldiers, treaties, and centuries of political engineering. It was the line that separated the organized world from the unknown. Yet when the Hun leaders appeared, this shield began to crack in ways no empire had ever witnessed. They did not simply invade, they dismantled reality itself, transforming borderlands into zones of terror, where messages were carved in fire, villages vanished overnight, and the old rules of conflict no longer applied. For the people who lived there, every dawn felt like an omen, every sound carried the possibility of devastation. Witnesses described the atmosphere before a Hunnic incursion as something almost supernatural, a tension that spread like sickness. Scouts reported movements that made no strategic sense, armies appearing and disappearing across open plains, as if the land itself were shifting beneath them. Rome's generals, trained in predictable formations and strict hierarchies, found themselves facing opponents who seemed to rewrite the meaning of strategy with each passing hour. But it was not only the mobility of the Hun warriors that broke the frontier. It was the mindset of their leaders, men who understood that terror was more powerful than any weapon. They used speed, silence, and unpredictability as instruments of psychological domination, ensuring that European defenses crumbled long before physical combat occurred. Border cities fell not because they lacked soldiers, but because their courage dissolved under the weight of stories that traveled faster than any rider. Tales of villages erased without warning, commanders who vanished without leaving bodies behind, and envoys who returned forever altered spread through Roman outposts like wildfire. And as these accounts multiplied, the line between fear and reality blurred. People began abandoning settlements before the first arrow was even fired. The frontier that Europe trusted had become a fragile illusion. If you've ever felt that moment when the world you rely on suddenly tilts, when a sense of safety dissolves in an instant, you understand a fraction of what those border communities endured. And before we move deeper into this forgotten landscape of dread, let me know your thoughts. Comment below with what part of this opening struck you the most. Leave a like if this kind of historical truth deserves to be exposed, and check if you're subscribed so you don't miss the continuation of this unfolding darkness as we press further into what the Hunnic leaders truly unleashed. The deeper you move into the history of the Hunnic rise, the clearer it becomes that their leaders did not simply appear on Europe's doorstep as a group of ambitious warriors. They emerged as the architects of a new reality, dismantling structures that had been considered immovable for generations. To understand their impact, you have to picture the world before their ascent. Empires negotiating with familiar enemies, generals reading strategies that worked for centuries, border commanders who believed they understood every threat the frontier could produce. Then, almost suddenly, everything those leaders trusted began to fail under the pressure of a force they couldn't categorize. The early Hunnic leaders studied the European world with a precision that felt almost clinical. They observed fortified towns, patrol systems, supply routes, diplomatic rituals, and the weaknesses embedded in every layer of European governance. What made their approach so devastating was not brute force, but their ability to move between the visible and invisible edges of conflict. They refused to appear in ways their opponents expected. One week, a Roman patrol would report distant figures on horseback watching from a ridge. The next, entire settlements would be found abandoned or burned, with no witnesses left alive. These patterns were not random. They were carefully orchestrated to destabilize the Roman sense of order. Information became a weapon long before arrows darkened the sky. The Hunnic leaders understood that fear travels faster than any army. They used it to fracture the very psychology of the frontier. Envoys sent to negotiate tribute or protection talked about the speed of Hun movements, the silence of their camps, the uncanny unity with which their horses responded, as if riders and animals shared a single intention. These stories spread across border towns like rumors born from nightmares, but they were rooted in direct encounters that soldiers could not forget. The European commanders who dismissed these accounts as exaggeration soon discovered that what seemed unbelievable was only the beginning. As the Huns advanced, they deliberately targeted the cracks in the Roman system. Frontier garrisons that relied on rigid formations found themselves unable to predict the direction or timing of attacks. Hunnic leaders exploited the overstretched defensive lines, hitting places that were poorly supplied or psychologically fragile. They struck at night, at dawn, during storms, or in perfect silence under clear skies. They appeared from forests where no cavalry should have been able to maneuver, crossed rivers that Europeans believed were impassable, and vanished into plains where scouts insisted no army could hide. Their unpredictability created a sense of helplessness that spread through the ranks of Rome's frontier defenders. Officers who once believed in disciplined control began to question their own reports. Messages sent to provincial governors carried an undertone of panic, describing movements that defied logic. Some commanders even requested relocation, not because they feared death, but because they feared losing their sanity in the constant tension of waiting for an enemy who might already be watching them from beyond the tree line. By the time European leaders realized the full scale of the transformation underway, their world had already changed. The frontier was no longer a boundary. It had become a zone of psychological erosion where the Hunnic leaders dictated the rhythm of fear and movement, reshaping the balance of power long before they challenged the heart of the continent. And as this shadow stretched across Europe, it became clear that the true collapse began not with armies meeting in open battle, but with the minds of those who once believed the frontier could protect them. As the frontier continued to unravel, European commanders began to realize that the Hunnic leaders were operating with a strategic vision that exceeded anything the continent had prepared for. Their methods were not merely unconventional. They were deliberately crafted to dismantle the mental framework on which European warfare depended. To them, a battlefield was not a physical location, but a psychological environment they could manipulate long before swords clashed or cavalry advanced. This shift in perspective allowed the Huns to dominate spaces that traditional armies believed they controlled, reshaping not only the tactics of conflict, but the very definition of threat. One of the most unsettling aspects of Hunnic strategy was their ability to move in ways that defied European understanding of time and distance. Roman scouts, trained to calculate the travel speed of cavalry based on terrain, weather, and supply weight, began filing reports that contradicted everything they had learned. Units of Hun riders were seen at dawn near one border settlement, then reported again at sunset far beyond any reasonable distance. These sightings were not illusions or errors. They were the result of a mobility system that the Romans could neither track nor predict. Hunnic leaders had engineered a method of movement that fused endurance, discipline, and an intimate knowledge of landscape into something that appeared almost supernatural. This mobility created a constant state of paranoia along the frontier. Soldiers no longer trusted the distances that once made them feel safe. A garrison that believed it had weeks to prepare for a threat suddenly found itself surrounded in days. Patrols returned with contradictory descriptions, some claiming the enemy dissolved into the plains, others insisting they were shadowed by riders whose presence could be felt more than seen. Every report left commanders uncertain whether they were confronting a massive force or dozens of smaller units designed to appear endless. That uncertainty alone weakened the frontier more effectively than any siege could. Hunnic leaders also excelled in exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of their opponents. They studied the reactions of Roman officers, learning who panicked, who hesitated, who relied too heavily on written orders, and who dispatched scouts without verifying their safety. They targeted these patterns with surgical precision. If a commander waited for reinforcements, the Huns struck before they arrived. If he attempted to fortify a town, they bypassed it entirely and ravaged the countryside, rendering the fortification useless. If he tried to negotiate, they answered with displays meant to fracture the morale of his troops. Abandoned. Fields filled with slaughtered livestock, burned watchtowers arranged with eerie deliberation, or messages carved into wooden gates that described events from miles away, as if the Hunnic leaders had been present themselves. To the Europeans experiencing these methods firsthand, the Huns seemed less like an army and more like a force of nature that refused to adhere to the boundaries of human expectation. Panic began to spread not through dramatic battles, but through the quiet moments between them, the sudden silence of forests where patrols vanished, the distant thunder of hooves that no one could locate, the unsettling knowledge that the enemy always seemed to know more than they should. This subtle erosion of confidence weakened even the strongest commanders, leaving them vulnerable to mistakes that the Hunnic leaders exploited relentlessly. By the time the Romans understood the scale of this transformation, their old doctrines had already collapsed under the weight of a new kind of war. The frontier was no longer a line to defend. It had become a shifting landscape of doubt, where every decision carried the fear that the enemy was already one step ahead and watching from somewhere just beyond the reach of torchlight. When the Hunnic forces finally reached the frontier cities themselves, the transformation from distant threat to immediate nightmare became undeniable. These settlements had long existed as the first line of defense, fortified with stone walls, trained garrisons, and systems that had proven effective against countless enemies. Yet none of those preparations mattered when the Hunnic leaders directed their attention toward them. What happened inside these frontier cities shocked even the most battle-hardened Roman officers, because the Huns did not begin by breaking walls. They began by breaking certainty. The first sign of their arrival was often not the sound of hooves, but silence. Entire stretches of forest surrounding a city would grow, unnaturally still, as if the natural world itself were retreating. Merchants returning from the roads began reporting strange patterns, abandoned wagons with no sign of struggle, footprints that appeared and vanished in soft soil, smoke rising from villages that should have been bustling with life. These fragmented signals spread through the city like whispers of an approaching storm that no one could predict or measure. By the time the sentries on the walls spotted movement on the horizon, fear had already entered the gates. When the Huns began their approach, they rarely attacked immediately. Instead, they encircled the city in a way that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. Riders formed shifting patterns along the perimeter, never remaining still long enough for defenders to count their numbers. At night, their campfires appeared in scattered clusters, disappearing and reappearing in different locations, as if the earth itself were moving beneath them. This fluid positioning created a suffocating tension. City leaders could not determine whether they were facing a massive invading force or an orchestrated illusion designed to paralyze decision-making. Inside the walls, Panic simmered. Families gathered what little they could carry, priests performed hurried rituals, and soldiers tightened armor with hands that trembled despite years of discipline. Messengers sent to neighboring outposts often never returned, leaving city commanders unsure whether reinforcements were coming at all. Hunger, isolation, and anticipation blended into a psychological siege long before the physical one began. Frontier communities had always lived with danger, but this was different. This was a sense of impending collapse engineered with surgical precision. When the assault finally started, it broke the last illusion of safety these cities held. The Hunnic leaders rarely employed the predictable rhythm of siege warfare. They struck from angles Roman strategists considered impossible, using terrain, speed, and coordinated misdirection to breach defenses in ways that appeared almost effortless. They attacked weak points, not because they were structurally fragile, but because they were psychologically vulnerable. Gates guarded by exhausted patrols, walls manned by units who had spent all night waiting for a threat they couldn't see. Once inside, the Huns did not linger. They moved through the streets with terrifying efficiency, avoiding unnecessary destruction yet making their presence unforgettable. They left behind scenes designed not merely to break a single city, but to serve as warnings to every settlement that still dared to resist. Survivors spoke of doors left open with no bodies inside, as if families had vanished rather than been killed. Others recalled unsettling quiet in the aftermath, broken only by the sound of unfamiliar symbols carved into wooden beams, messages meant to echo long after the dust settled. For the Roman world, these frontier cities were not just defensive structures, they were symbols of stability and order. Watching them fall in such disorienting, unpredictable ways shattered the confidence of an entire empire. The Europeans who survived these events carried the weight of something that felt larger than war, something that reshaped their understanding of what domination could look like. If any part of this descent into the frontier struck you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps keep these forgotten chapters alive. What made the Hunnic presence truly terrifying was not only their ability to destroy cities, but the invisible system of psychological domination their leaders wove around every encounter. This system operated beneath the surface of warfare, shaping how communities behaved long before a single arrow was fired. To European observers, it felt as though the Huns could reach into the minds of entire populations, bending them through fear, uncertainty, and the calculated manipulation of expectations. And unlike the devastation of battle, this form of control left no ruins behind, only people who no longer trusted the world they lived in. One of the most unsettling aspects of this system was the precision with which the Hunnic leaders studied human behavior. They understood that fear thrives in gaps in information, in communication, in visibility. So they deliberately created those gaps. Messengers who vanished without a trace, patrols that returned with contradictory stories, scouts who saw shadows moving in the distance but could not describe what they were seeing. These fragments accumulated within frontier communities like cracks forming in ice. With each one, confidence weakened, and the population's belief in its own defenses began to erode. The Hunnic leaders exploited this erosion by controlling the rhythm of their appearances. Sometimes they showed overwhelming force, flooding the horizon with mounted warriors who seemed to move as one organism. Other times, they approached with near silence, sending only small groups whose presence felt more like an omen than a threat. The unpredictability of these strategies created a permanent tension along the frontier. Entire towns began behaving differently. Gates closed earlier, trade slowed, and soldiers slept in armor not because they were ordered to, but because their instincts refused to relax. Fear had become a governing force. The Huns also mastered the art of information distortion. Stories spread ahead of them, often fueled by their own deliberate theatrics. They left behind scenes that were not merely violent, but symbolic. Burned villages arranged with a strange, unsettling order. Broken weapons placed in patterns that suggested warnings rather than chaos. Horses left standing with no riders, as if abandoned in the middle of a thought. These eerie details traveled across the frontier in the mouths of refugees and soldiers, evolving into legends that carried more weight than any formal chronicle. The Hunnic leaders understood that a terrified mind amplifies everything it perceives. This atmosphere made every decision along the frontier heavier. Should a city prepare for siege or attempt negotiation? Should scouts pursue a distant sighting or stay behind the safety of the walls? Each choice felt like an invitation for disaster. Commanders who once relied on logic and training now doubted their instincts. Even when the Huns were nowhere near, their influence shaped the behavior of entire provinces. Fear became a shadow that lengthened across Europe, stretching from the smallest village to the halls of imperial authority. What made this system so effective was that it required almost no direct confrontation. The Hunnic leaders could destabilize a region without drawing a sword. They used the threat of violence more effectively than violence itself. In doing so, they seized control over the psychological landscape of their opponents, reshaping how Europe perceived danger, authority, and the fragility of human order. What began as whispers on the frontier soon became a continental tremor, a realization that the old ways of understanding war were dissolving under a power that attacked not the walls of cities, but the certainty within people's minds. And as this unseen machinery of fear continued to spread, it set the stage for consequences even darker than the initial shock. Consequences that Europe would struggle to comprehend as the Hunnic leaders pressed deeper into territory once believed to be untouchable. As the Hunnic leaders pressed further into European territories, their mastery of psychological warfare blended seamlessly with diplomatic cunning. They understood that dominance was not only enforced through blades and arrows, but through perception, coercion, and the careful orchestration of fear across multiple layers of society. Envoys carrying demands for tribute, ultimatums veiled in promises, and messages that implied unimaginable consequences all functioned as instruments of control. These leaders had developed a system in which diplomacy itself became a weapon, bending local rulers and populations alike before the first clash of armies occurred. Every message sent to border governors carried more than words. It carried proof of consequences and the unseen presence of the Hunnic forces. Villages found empty with their gates swinging in the wind, fields scorched in patterns suggesting observation and calculation rather than random destruction. Envoys returned with tales that defied rational explanation. Roads clear yet strewn with symbols, forests silent yet bristling with invisible watchers. Through this choreography of terror, leaders shaped the psychological landscape long before a single soldier stepped across the frontier. The Hunnic approach to diplomacy was equally precise. Tributes were demanded not only as a form of submission, but as a tangible reminder of what would happen if defiance persisted. Payments, often framed as offers of peace, reinforced a message of control. The Huns dictated both the terms of engagement and the measure of obedience. Governors who attempted negotiation without demonstrating absolute deference found their cities subtly undermined, supplies delayed, patrols misdirected, morale eroded. Each action, seemingly small and indirect, was a component of a broader strategy designed to ensure that when confrontation came, it would not merely be physical but mental. This manipulation extended beyond rulers to the very populations of the frontier. Citizens lived in a heightened state of anxiety, aware that at any moment the invisible line between survival and destruction could be crossed. The Hunnic leaders understood the amplifying effect of rumor and narrative. Reports of villages erased, towns abandoned, and messages carved into wood or etched into the earth spread faster than armies could march. Even those who had never directly seen the Huns internalized a sense of constant threat, becoming unwitting participants in the system of fear. The frontier itself became a psychological instrument, shaped by leaders who had learned to leverage perception as a force more destructive than any sword. In this environment, European strategies failed to keep pace. Even the most disciplined garrisons found themselves reacting to threats that might never materialize in full, their efforts undermined by uncertainty, fatigue, and the subtle erosion of confidence. Commanders who relied on traditional formations and predictable reinforcements discovered that the Hunnic leaders had already anticipated every assumption. Their campaigns were designed to destabilize before contact, to weaken resolve, and to make the very act of defense a perilous gamble. The physical conquest was secondary. The primary objective was a total psychological surrender. By combining coercive diplomacy with precise psychological manipulation, the Hunnic leaders created an almost invisible empire of influence. They reshaped the European frontier not just through raids and invasions, but through a methodical recalibration of perception, forcing rulers, soldiers, and civilians to live within a reality defined by the Huns' expectations. And as the echo of their presence spread across towns and forests, it became clear that this approach was far more enduring and terrifying than any traditional military advance. The reputation of the Hunnic leaders extended far beyond the immediate destruction they wrought on towns and villages. What struck fear into the hearts of Europe's most seasoned commanders was not only their ferocity in battle, but the methods of intimidation that accompanied every campaign. These were leaders who understood that terror could travel faster than armies, and that the mere anticipation of their presence could shatter morale more effectively than any siege engine. The fear they cultivated became a weapon as sharp and precise as the arrowhead, striking the mind long before it struck the body. Every village along the frontier became a theater for psychological operations. Leaders orchestrated appearances that seemed impossible, arriving from directions no one expected, vanishing before reinforcements could react, and leaving behind scenes that communicated control and inevitability. Entire garrisons would surrender or flee, not from physical incapacity, but because their perception of the Huns' reach had been altered. It was as if these leaders had mastered the ability to bend reality itself, showing a level of foresight and planning that left even their enemies trembling with uncertainty. Their approach to intimidation extended to symbolic acts designed to amplify the fear experienced by entire communities. They left messages etched into gates or carved into the walls of burned homes, recounting actions already completed miles away, suggesting omnipresence and omniscience. Sometimes, villages were found abandoned with no bodies or visible destruction, creating a haunting sense of disappearance that gnawed at the minds of survivors and neighboring settlements. The effect was relentless, a network of terror that preemptively destabilized resistance, turning the frontier into a landscape dominated not by physical conquest, but by mental subjugation. Even armies that attempted to confront them found themselves ensnared in a web of psychological warfare. Units trained in strict formations and disciplined strategy were drawn into overreactions, misreading small movements as signs of overwhelming force. Scouts returned with conflicting reports, and the uncertainty multiplied across command chains. Decisions that once relied on observation and logic now had to factor in unpredictability, creating hesitation and confusion that Hunnic leaders exploited without ever firing a single arrow. Fear became the invisible bridge connecting every village, every commander, every soldier to the Hunnic presence. The scale and consistency of these methods produced results that were as systematic as they were horrifying. The Hunnic leaders did not need to strike every target directly. Their influence radiated through anticipation and perception, forcing European defenders to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. Even the bravest soldiers were affected, carrying the anxiety of what might come, preparing for attacks that could appear at any moment, in any configuration, in any combination they had not imagined. Their mental exhaustion preceded physical confrontation, leaving the frontier vulnerable before combat even began. These leaders understood human psychology with terrifying clarity. Every display, every maneuver, every abandoned village served to reinforce the narrative of invincibility. Entire towns adjusted their routines to survive, while soldiers doubted their own judgment in ways that made them easier to manipulate. The Huns had transformed intimidation into an art form, one that left an indelible mark on the European frontier. And as you reflect on these tactics, consider what it meant for the people who witnessed them firsthand. How do you survive when your own mind becomes the battlefield? If this account of strategy and terror has captured your attention, share your thoughts in the comments below. Which method of intimidation shocked you the most? Your perspective keeps these hidden chapters alive and ensures that the lessons of the frontier are not forgotten. The collapse of traditional defenses along the European frontier was not sudden. It was a process meticulously engineered by the Hunnic leaders through a combination of speed, unpredictability, and psychological mastery. What European commanders had once considered fixed truths, the reliability of watchtowers, the timing of patrols, the predictability of supply lines, became liabilities under the Hunnic strategy. The frontier transformed into a landscape where assumptions no longer held, and every calculated decision risked catastrophic failure. In effect, the Huns rewrote the rules of engagement, not through overwhelming numbers alone, but through the careful orchestration of fear and confusion. Their raids often began long before the first physical confrontation. Scouts sent to report enemy movements returned with accounts of empty fields, livestock disappearing under cover of night, and fires that burned in geometric patterns designed to signal presence without direct contact. These subtle yet deliberate manipulations disrupted the rhythm of life in frontier towns. Soldiers became trapped in cycles of alert and fatigue, unsure if the next signal represented a real threat or another demonstration of Hunnic ingenuity. Each misstep in judgment was quietly punished by the erosion of morale, creating gaps that could be exploited without engaging in open combat. The Hunnic leaders understood that the perception of power often outweighs its actual use. By demonstrating speed and the ability to appear in multiple locations almost simultaneously, they created an illusion of omnipresence. Garrisoned towns could see traces of the Hunnic advance in unexpected places, reinforcing the narrative that resistance was futile. For commanders, this perception was paralyzing. Orders given to soldiers might be irrelevant the moment they were received, and reinforcements could arrive too late or be rendered unnecessary, as entire regions abandoned their positions in fear. In this way, the Huns extended their influence far beyond the reach of their physical presence. Beyond the tactical, the Hunnic approach exploited social and psychological vulnerabilities at every level. Civilians internalized the threat, adjusting their behavior to avoid confrontation even before the Huns arrived. Families fled, leaving behind stores and livestock, creating logistical chaos for defending forces. Soldiers became hyper-aware, second-guessing every movement, every report, every signal, while the Huns watched from a distance, calculating how uncertainty could be weaponized. This constant mental strain transformed the frontier into a theatre where anticipation of violence was often more destructive than violence itself. Even when the Huns engaged in direct attacks, their approach was measured, precise, and psychologically informed. They targeted points of weakness that were not always obvious, striking in ways that maximized terror and minimized predictable counteraction. Burned gates and abandoned villages carried as much significance as the raiders themselves, demonstrating the futility of resistance while reinforcing the Hunnic reputation. Every act, no matter how small, was a signal to the next settlement that the same outcome awaited them if they resisted. By reshaping the landscape of both perception and reality, the Hunnic leaders ensured that the European frontier could no longer function as it had for centuries. Defensive structures, once symbols of stability, became reminders of vulnerability. Soldiers and civilians alike were forced into reactive patterns, constantly adjusting to threats that might never appear, yet always felt imminent. The Huns had not only breached walls, they had breached the very sense of security that held the frontier together, creating an enduring atmosphere of uncertainty and dread that would define the region for years to come. The human cost of the Hunnic campaigns extended far beyond what official records ever captured. While chroniclers focused on armies, victories, and territorial shifts, they rarely recorded the lives quietly shattered along the frontier. Families disappeared without trace, entire villages were abandoned, and communities became haunted landscapes of fear and uncertainty. People who survived the initial raids carried memories that no ledger could quantify, yet these experiences shaped the social and cultural fabric of Europe for generations. The psychological scars left by Hunnic strategy became as consequential as the physical destruction. One of the most devastating aspects of this human toll was the erosion of trust. Communities that had relied on local networks for safety, neighbors, watchmen, even religious authorities, found those structures failing under the weight of unpredictability. The Hunnic leaders understood that fear of the unknown could destabilize more effectively than any assault. When soldiers returned from patrols, exhausted and unable to verify what they had seen, their commanders faced decisions with incomplete information. Every hesitation, every misjudgment, magnified the impact of the Huns' calculated presence. Survival was determined not solely by skill or strength, but by how quickly one could adapt to a constantly shifting reality. Children grew up in landscapes marked by abrupt abandonment and sudden violence. They learned early that the world beyond their doors could vanish overnight. Stories of neighbors taken, villages burned, and messages carved into trees and gates circulated as warnings and myths simultaneously. These narratives reinforced the Huns' psychological hold, turning collective memory into a tool of control. Even those who escaped direct encounter carried the weight of fear, spreading it to others and amplifying its reach across regions. The Hunnic leaders had mastered a subtle yet total domination. They made the anticipation of violence as powerful as the violence itself. Furthermore, the Huns' campaigns disrupted economic and social structures. Trade routes became dangerous, agricultural cycles were interrupted, and long-standing alliances fractured under stress. Communities were forced into mobility, abandoning centuries of habitation, sometimes relocating hundreds of miles to escape the invisible reach of the Hunnic influence. Every action, every retreat, every decision to flee was a reinforcement of the narrative that resistance was futile and compliance, however reluctant, was necessary for survival. This manipulation of environment, resources, and behavior extended the reach of Hunnic authority far beyond the limits of their armies. The psychological devastation was compounded by the unpredictability of outcomes. Some towns, even when fully prepared, survived intact. Others, less fortified or less fortunate, were destroyed entirely. This inconsistency fueled confusion, making the frontier population question every choice they made. Trust in strategy, leadership, and even intuition eroded under the weight of this relentless uncertainty. The Hunnic leaders had not only mastered battlefield tactics, they had mastered the collapse of expectation, leaving their opponents to navigate a world where every assumption could be fatal. In effect, the Hunnic leaders' impact extended far beyond the immediate scope of conquest. The lives lost, the communities destabilized, and the pervasive fear created a long-lasting shadow over Europe's borderlands. These human consequences, largely absent from official records, reveal a dimension of warfare that combined physical, social, and psychological mastery. The frontier was no longer merely a defensive line. It had become a theater for the Huns' most enduring weapon, the power to alter perception, break will, and leave an entire civilization trembling long before any swords were drawn. The legacy of the Hunnic leaders stretched far beyond the immediate destruction of frontier settlements or the terror imposed upon armies and civilians. What they created was an enduring system of domination, one that combined fear, unpredictability, and strategic precision to ensure that every corner of Europe understood the price of defiance. Their influence did not fade with the passage of seasons or the deaths of leaders. It echoed in the way communities rebuilt, in the way borders were defended, and in the collective memory of those who survived. This shadow lingered for generations, a silent reminder that control could be asserted as effectively through perception as through force. By the time European powers attempted to reclaim stability, the Hunnic strategy had reshaped not just territories, but the minds of those inhabiting them. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike carried an ingrained caution, a heightened awareness of the unseen forces that could strike at any moment. The Hunnic leaders had demonstrated that psychological mastery could complement physical power, that terror orchestrated with foresight could weaken empires long before their armies clashed. They had rewritten the rules of engagement, leaving behind a frontier that would never look the same again. And yet, understanding this history is not simply about recounting violence or celebrating strategic genius. It is about recognizing the resilience and fragility of human societies when confronted by calculated terror. The people who endured these campaigns, whether through flight, survival, or adaptation, provide lessons in endurance that official records often overlook. Their experiences reveal the human capacity to navigate impossible circumstances, to survive and to remember, even when memory itself is shaped by fear. The Huns' influence was absolute, yet the traces of survival remind us that history is not determined solely by those who impose it, but also by those who endure it. As we reflect on the scale of these events, it becomes clear that the impact of the Hunnic leaders reaches far beyond simple conquest. They left a blueprint for the use of fear as a weapon, a system that combined mobility, unpredictability, and psychological insight to dominate entire regions. And while the armies have vanished, the lessons remain. European societies learned to anticipate terror, to understand unpredictability, and to recognize that survival often requires navigating a world where perception can be as dangerous as reality itself. If you followed this journey through the Hunnic campaigns and frontier collapse, take a moment to engage. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I survived the frontier," if this account changed the way you see history. Hit like if you value these hidden truths, and make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss future deep dives into the darkest chapters of the past. There's a video right beside this one that continues exploring the consequences of strategic terror across Europe. Click it and continue with me on this journey. Understanding history is more than learning events. It's witnessing the forces that shaped civilizations, and the Huns' shadow remains one of the most profound.